Good morning, everyone, and our apologies. We've had some technical difficulties this morning, but we're now all with you. My name is Yoonjung Park. I am the program director for the Africa China Initiative at Georgetown University, and you are in the webinar on new research on China-Africa engagement and impacts on peace and security. We're really excited to have representatives from 4 new research projects that have just been completed and are still in draft form in terms of being written up. But we're really excited to have these emerging African scholars present their work to all of you and to introduce them and tell you a little bit more about the project that funded and supported these researchers. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Obert Hodzi. Obert has been a very close colleague over the past half dozen years now, and he is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Liverpool, as well as chair of the executive board of the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Network. Obert, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Yun, and thank you everyone for joining us. Just to briefly say that over the past year or so, we have been working with about 10 early career researchers based in African institutions. The whole idea, and we had people from Zimbabwe, from Ghana, from Tunisia, Kenya, Cameroon, Somaliland. The whole idea of this project was to support researchers based in African institutions to write from their perspectives issues on China-Africa relations. I think it's especially important at this time because most of the work that we read on China-Africa is from the perspective of perhaps Africans in the diaspora or from a Western perspective. And that African perspective has been missing for a while. So what you're going to witness today are 4 of those projects that have been done over the past year. They have done extensive field research in different African countries, and they'll talk a little bit about that. So the whole idea is to build capacity of Africans to write about issues that do affect them, not to hear them from other people's perspective. So bringing the agency of African researchers to contribute to this work on China-Africa relations. So capacity building was the main issue, was the main focus of this program. But secondly, it is also community building. We all understand some of the challenges that come with researching on China-Africa relations. It's really difficult, especially these days, but especially difficult if you are based at an institution in Africa where there is very limited funding to conduct research, but also many other issues about access to the Chinese actors and also to African actors, because sometimes we take that for granted. So I'm glad that we have been able to work with these amazing scholars, and they have built a community to share ideas and their research. So you'll hear from Cameroon, Kenya, Somaliland, and Zimbabwe. So I'll introduce the participants that we have today. We have Philip Kaudo. Philip is a PhD candidate in public policy and is a part-time lecturer in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. He will talk about private security companies in Kenya, and then he will do a comparative case study analysis of Chinese, local, and Western private security actors. After Philip, we'll hear from Bianca Epede-Mesumbe. She is the Growth and Investment Officer in an organization called Women in Entrepreneurship and Technology, and she is based in Yaoundé, Cameroon. She will talk about government policy on mining and security in Central Africa and mostly focus on Chinese companies established in Eastern Cameroon. And the third speaker will be Mustafa Ahmad. Mustafa is an independent researcher and writer, and he has worked on this project with Sakat Muhammad, who is a researcher and master student at Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. They will talk about shared isolation, strategic collaboration, and they will unpack Somaliland and Taiwan relations. And I want to say perhaps this is one of the first research that I've come across on Somaliland and China. Our last speaker will be Prolific Mataruse. Prolific is based at the Institute at the University of Wigwe University in Nigeria, and he will talk about the geopolitics of Chinese coal and lithium investments in Zimbabwe. We have an amazing discussant, the managing editor of Premium Times in Nigeria, Mr. Idris Ikinbajo, and he will come and kind of like wrap up and give his opinions on these presentations that we have had. So I'll hand over to Philip now. Philip, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Obata. Yes, I'm sharing thought. My topic was to examine private security companies in Kenya, and I'm doing a comparative case study analysis of both Chinese, Western, and local private security actors. I've narrowed down to 6 private security players in Kenya, which I'll be able to identify as time moves by. One of the reasons why I was intrigued by this topic is that in the context of Kenya and globally, you realize that the traditional conceptualization of the role of the state is debatable. Because if you look at even it from the Weberian conceptualization of security, or even the classical theorists and the social contract theories, the state ought to be the principal guarantor of security. But in the recent past, private security actors are taking a very center stage, and this is largely influenced by security sector reforms, which tend to emphasize on the centrality of the need to include all actors on matters of security, but also with the rise of the structural adjustment programs in which budgetary restrictions were made on the state. The state also became incapacitated to offer security, and therefore there was need for a shift to the private actors. My study is centered on 6 case studies, and most of the private security players that I've selected are those that have had contracts or relationship with the Chinese private security actors in the context of Kenya. Just to put you into context, you realize that in the context of Kenya, and even across the globe, private security companies are supposed to complement a state security provision. What makes the most relevant today is the fact that there is increasing demand for security, and the state is not having the capacity to offer such kind of needs. If you look at it in terms of even the ratio of state vis-a-vis private security actors across the globe, you realize that there is a very big margin. For instance, in developing countries, you realize that the ratio between private security and the police, for instance, is 10-1. In the UK, it is 2-1. In the US, 3-1. Kenya is 1-6. So you realize that indeed, private security players are playing a very dominant role. The private security actors that I selected in the context for this study, one is called the G4S, which is a British private security, which is dominant in Kenya. We have Dewey Security, which is a new entrant in Kenyan private security market. We have Frontier Service Group, which is also a new entrant. In fact, joined the market in 2014. We have KK. This is a dominant local private security firm, which in 2019 was procured by a Canadian firm. And also we have Seneca East Africa, which remains a local private security firm in Kenya, which has had experiences with working together with Chinese private security actors in Kenya. And therefore, my main research question one was to understand the motives for private security companies in Kenya. Why are they interested in Kenyan market? And with a focus also on Chinese actors. I also look at some of their clients, security clients in Kenya. The other thing is what motivates clients to select a private security vis-a-vis the other, and then also to look at their adaptive mechanisms. And finally, the private security environment is very competitive. How does Chinese private security firms fit in the larger private security environment in Kenya? This study for social scientists, you can integrate a lot of theories just to support it. Maybe Barry Buzant, you can look at Barton's human needs theory, among others, just to put it into context. Okay, so the overall themes in my study, just before the overall themes, one is that I realized, or the finding of my study revealed that increased demand for security beyond the state has necessitated the growth of private security firms in the context of Kenya. Number two, the proliferation of private security companies have coincided with increasing foreign direct investment globally and as well as in Kenya. And number three, the impact of private security companies globally is mixed. They are acting as both security stabilizers and also destabilizers. And finally, weak private security regulations have fostered the growth of private security companies in Kenya. On a larger perspective, just as I've already stated in the first context, is that the impact of private security firms and their activities is mixed. On one side, they are guarantors of security. On the other side, they are destabilizers of security. For instance, just to put into context, you realize that a Chinese firm by the name Diwi Security, which is very dominant in South Sudan, was able to partner with South Sudanese forces for purposes of evacuating 300 Chinese oil workers during the civil wars in 2016. Same applies to what we call the VSS Private Security Group, which partners again with the Sudanese forces for purposes of evacuating Chinese nationals who were held up at the South Kordofan province. But again, if you look at it in the context of Zambia, you realize that Chinese contractors have been found to be involved in illegal activities, which are still subject to further interrogation. And across the globe, you realize even the G4S is very dominant in terms of security provision, even in the major airports, among other areas. So there's a two-way angle or lens in which we can evaluate, analyze the role of private security actors globally, both as security providers and as well as destabilizers of security. On the first objective, under the motives of private security companies in Kenya, one of the most dominant motive that the study established is that the proliferation of private security actors in Kenya. The first one is about they are interested in maximization of profit. And remember that private security actors tend to be privately owned, though some of them are publicly owned as well. Private security players are privately owned, and to a large extent, they are also multinational corporations, and therefore they pursue capitalist interest. And the next motive is the desire to tap market opportunities in the context that they are interested in filling the security vacuum that is already established. And once they tap the market opportunities, then they are able to maximize on available market opportunities. And finally, is to protect vested interest. If you come to Kenya, for instance, Total petrol station, for instance, is dominantly guarded by G4S. But also you realize that Chinese actors are also having a very active role in protecting Chinese assets in Africa. Like on a global perspective, look at the China Security and Technology Group. It is very dominant in Guinea and even in other areas where it, as found by Nantulia, they are more interested in preservation of the vested interest of foreign actors. And finally, these actors are also very important because they create employment opportunities. Like the local farm, you look at the Seneca, you look at G4S, has created employment opportunity for more than 25,000 Kenyans. You look at the other one, Wells Fargo, 8,000 employment opportunities. So the motive is both profit maximization, tapping market opportunities, protecting vested, and also creating employment opportunities. One of the dynamism in the context of Kenya is that there is an increased partnership, and I think China is getting into Kenyan market and is really leveraging on partnership. Local firms today in Kenya, like the KK Security, Kenya Kazi Security, for in full, is partnering with Gadaworld. There are so many reasons that why partnership is a dominant player, a dominant trend in Kenya. One is that through partnership, these local firms are able to gain reputation, but also partnership also enable them to maximize on profit. They are also to comply with the local content requirements. Like in the context of Kenya, foreign actors are not allowed to employ, are supposed to meet the 40% requirement in their relations or in their activities in Kenya. So by partnership, they are able to comply with that kind of provision and also to expand market opportunities. In fact, in the context of KK Security, a dominant firm, since it partnered with Gadaworld, it has expanded to 15 African countries. So you can see how partnership is a very important element. Apart from also, it is also cheap and create employment opportunities. One of the very interesting aspect that also this study was able to find out is that private security actors thrive because of the political networking that they have established. Remember, the market is very competitive. There are so many players in the context of Kenya, more than 2,000 private security players. And therefore, for the dominant private security players like KK Security, G4S, among these others, they are politically entrenched. And you find, if you look at their boards, their board of management, you'll realize very dominant political players in Kenya as parts of them. Some of them even former vice president, controller of budgets, among others, controller of the State House, members of parliament as constituting of this board. The essence of political networking is that through political network, they are able to broker deals. They are able to identify markets and even win tenders. In the context of DW security, political networking plays very important role. However, the role of networking is playing at the contracting level, where they are signing agreement for the asset which is supposed to be developed. The other adaptive mechanism is mergers and acquisitions. In the context of G4S, I've told you G4S was able to merge with what is called the United Parcel Unit. Seneca, a local firm here, has merged with Secura. Wells Fargo has merged with Fargo Curas. KK has merged with others. KK has also joined Gadaworld. So you can see how merging enhances their competitiveness in the market. The other mechanism is subcontracting, like what defines DW security in the Kenyan market as a Chinese firm is its ability to subcontract. And DW has been able to subcontract so many private security players in Kenya, key among them Hatari, the Seneca, KK, in helping it protect the standard gauge railway and other Chinese assets, like just like the Tuake Dam, the LAPSET project. It has integrated subcontract local firms. And the essence of subcontracting of local firms in the context of Chinese firms is the fact that these private security firms like Dewey Security are operating in very insecure regions in terms of security. Yes, Chinese regulations prohibit Chinese players from owning guns. So because to avoid all this exposure, security exposure, they tend to subcontract. But again, subcontracting is very critical because it is very cheap. And the other thing is that with subcontracting, they are able to address cultural differences that are dominant in their interactions in the Kenyan market.
All
We
right,
also
Philip,
have
can I ask you to wrap up, please?
Yes, thank you, Prof. Just finalizing. The other element that I also wanted to look at globally and even the Kenyan market, clients utilize a lot of criteria to select the private security that they will want to interact with them. Some of them are institutional criteria, like the nature of system that these private security players have, their market experience, technological capacity, reputation and trust, their diversity. How diverse is the private security? Is it able to provide multiple security services, among others? Just as I conclude, one of critical issues that I did find that in the context of Kenya today is that Chinese private security actors, firms, are predominantly interested in preservation of Chinese investments in Africa. Number two, the Western firms are still most preferred in Kenyan market because of different reasons. Key among them is that they have a historical attachment with the local clients. And then if you look at the relationship between the local firms and the Chinese players and even the Western firm, there are two discussions that emerge. One is that there are actors who believe that these foreign firms create employment opportunities, but others believe that they are so competitive, and therefore they dilute the local market, and therefore the local firms are not able to dominate the market. And in conclusion, two things. One is that the private security firms in Kenya complement and also undermine security different ways. Number one, in the context of Kenya, you look at Dewey Security, which is a Chinese private security firm. It has partnered with Kenyan security forces, and this partnership led to the development of a security plan that is currently used to manage the standard gauge railway. They also enhance surveillance, monitoring of security threats. Once information is received, they share it to the relevant state actors. And the other most important thing of foreign firms in Kenya, with reference to Dewey Security, is that Dewey Security was able to train local actors and Kenyans, Kenyan who are subcontracted, on crime prevention and detection. They are also critical through subcontracting on the provision of guarding services. They have also been able to collaborate with the police to maintain public order and to protect assets. Like look at Del Monte currently being protected by G4S, Dewey Security in this SGR, Tuake Dam, and even other places. And therefore, you look at it, you find that in Kenya today, to a larger extent, security players have been able to provide a complementing role in supporting the state in all these other issues. But we also have very fundamental issue of regulation. And just as it is noted by the Kenya Private Security Regulation Act, that there could be 2,000 private security actors in Kenya, but only less than 300 of them are registered. Only 700 of them are registered, but only 300 of them are part and parcels of union. And now this brings a very fundamental question. Look at how significant security is and how comes we have very weak regulation and how does it expose our security to this? And as Nantulia says, Kenya is a permissive setting in security provision. And that is why we have dominant, we have many private security players in Kenya. Otherwise, thank you, Prof. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Philip. Appreciate your intervention there. And this is valuable research in a growing body of literature on private security companies in Africa. Let's turn now to Bianca and her research. Bianca, go ahead and turn on your camera and your mic. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Yoon, and good day to everyone. It's a pleasure for me to share my research on the topic government policy on mining and security in Central Africa, focusing on the case of Chinese companies established in Eastern Cameroon. So just as for context, the East region of Cameroon. Cameroon has 10 regions. The East region is one of the most resource-rich regions of the country, with large deposits of gold, iron ore, bauxite, copper, and many other minerals. So mining activity is very intense in that part of the country. But an observation that we have over the years, since Cameroon established diplomatic and commercial relations with China, we have noticed an increasing presence of the Chinese companies in Cameroon and even more predominant presence in the mining sector. So it has pushed many Cameroonians and researchers to ask some questions if there is a particular preference for Chinese companies, if it is that they are the only ones that have the competency to exploit those minerals, and also if the procedures are actually respected when granting the mining permits to them. So all of these elements motivated our research, and we traveled to the East region, conducted field activities for a couple of weeks, and we had one-on-one sessions with officials from the Ministry of Mines and Industries in Cameroon and the regional delegation of mining in the East region of Cameroon. They gave us a perspective on how the mining code of Cameroon is established, the different requirements and procedures that have to be respected for each category of mining, because different mining is done at different levels. There are artisanal mining, there is semi-mechanized mining, there is industrial mining, and all of those have different levels of approval to go through to be able to have the permit that allows you as a company to implement to establish your mining activity. So the feedback that we got from the officials that we interviewed, and even our own observations on the field, we spoke to the residents in these. The feedback to Cameroonians, that is how it is written down in the mining code of Cameroon, but on the field we realized that that is not respected. And that is enabled by the fact that most Chinese companies, they have like a figurehead who is a Cameroonian, who facilitates the process for them to obtain these permits. But on the field, the Chinese working in all the domains from the artisanal to the semi-mechanized to even the industrial mining permits that are granted by the government through the President of the Republic or the Ministry of Mining themselves. But even in those cases, we have industrial mining permits that have been granted and that push the public at times to even manifest contempt, because the criteria are not really met for these companies, but there seems to be a preference or a preference, yes, in the policy of Cameroon now, even in contradiction to its own mining code, to grant mining permits to Chinese companies. And the most disturbing part of it is that these companies, these Chinese miners on the field, do not respect basic environmental and national labor law requirements. Most of the workers they have on their sites do not have contracts, do not have any social security protection as required when you employ a Cameroonian in any sector of activity. And even the environmental hazards that are caused, security hazards are really alarming. We were on the field, we saw huge excavations, mining sites that have turned into
Sorry, we seem to have lost Bianca briefly. Hopefully we can return to her. Perhaps we can move on to the next research project. I believe Saad is going to report on the research that he carried out with Mustafa, and Mustafa will take questions later that come to them. Also, please recall that the audience has the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Please go ahead and start inserting questions for any of the particular research projects using the Q&A. Okay, Saad, turning over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yon, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. Me and my colleague Mustafa have conducted an original research on Somaliland and Taiwan relations. On the summer of 2022, Somaliland and Taiwan have established an official relationship by exchanging offices and representatives, but also by opening a diplomatic office on their respective countries. This relationship was informed by shared reality of both entities, Taiwan being an unrecognized entity and Somaliland being also an unrecognized entity. But also this relationship was underpinned by the fact that Taiwan have for a while, since 1971, when China have regained its seat in United Nations, have been isolated by one China policy that China have spearheaded. On the other hand, Somaliland was also, with the absence of international recognition, have been under the one Somalia policy that international organizations and international community have treated as a part of Somalia. This research has set out to understand the rationale and the logic behind Somaliland and Taiwan relations and what each side have tried to achieve. Our research objective was to analyze the motivation behind Somaliland and Taiwan relationship, to understand the challenges and the opportunities or the factors that make the relationship sustainable going forward. And on the last one, we tried to examine US engagement and its implications for this relationship. The main research question that we tried to unpack in our research was, what are the factors that driven and sustaining this relationship, and how this relationship have stood despite the fact that they are facing a strong opposition from China and Somalia. And by conducting our research, some of the findings, before I go that, let me talk about the motives that were driving on Somaliland, or the rationale that was motivating Somaliland to pursue this relationship. There is three major factors that play a role for Somaliland to pursue this relationship. One was breaking diplomatic isolation. After 30 years of self-de facto rule, Somaliland have seen opportunity to pursue ties with Taiwan with the hope that it will get or have a close, connections with USA, but also other international partners. And also it pursued this relationship with Taiwan with the economic opportunity and by attracting an international investment. And the third point was to bolster its international reputation as a reliable and reliable partner. On the Taiwanese side, motivation for pursuing this relationship was challenge in One China policy, and economic ambition, particularly vital resources and minerals, and also establishing an alliance against Chinese that have been outbid in Taiwan, especially when it comes to Africa, and creating an alliance that's founded on mutual interests and also democratic values. And some of the findings that we come across in our research was strategic isolation and collaboration was a major factor for both entities to use and establish this relationship. Geopolitical tension is also some of the points that we find in our research. Somalia and China have strongly opposed the relationship, deeming as a infringement of their sovereignty and territorial integrity. Economic and security factors was also part of Somaliland and Taiwan relationship. We have seen a close security cooperation between Somaliland and Taiwan. Somaliland currently is the largest recipient of security assistance that Taiwanese have provided to those states that they maintain a close cooperation and relationship. And another factor that we find in our research was US engagement. Since Somaliland have established a relationship with Taiwan, we have seen the language that has been used, the cooperation between Somaliland and USA was referring Taiwan and US, especially the US National Security Council have welcomed initially when Somaliland have forged relationship with Taiwan. But also one last point on our finding was there is some challenges, especially unmet economic expectations and the pressure that's coming from China, which poses a risk for the long term in terms of sustainability in this relationship. The study have established, in terms of our conclusion, the study have established that the possible motive from Somaliland perspective to establish the relationship with Taiwan come under three perspectives, like I say, breaking diplomatic isolation by getting allies. Many years Somaliland have lobbied in states in Africa, Asia, and the West for direct engagement with Somaliland and recognition as an independent state from Somalia. This has failed despite the engaging talks with Somalia hosted by international actors, including UK, UAE, and Turkey, and Djibouti. On the other hand, Taiwan was motivated by a drive to establish relationship with other states and improve its global standing at a time when it has recently faced outbidding by China. In the past few decades, succeeding in ending the country's ties with the states like in the continents of Africa, which is the only country in Africa that maintains an official relationship with Taiwan. For Taiwan, relationship with Somaliland presents an opportunity to engage states in Horn of Africa and the wider region of East Africa after absence of more than 16 years. And their representative office, Taiwanese representative office in Hargeisa covers many countries, including Ethiopia, Tanzania, Kenya, and Djibouti. And one last point in my conclusion, despite the political and economic pressure that both sides, the long-term benefit, so far 5 years have been went through and the relationship have stood the different pressures that they confront so far. The future sustainability of this relationship will depend on economic cooperation and diplomatic maneuvering and common strategy to make most out of this relationship, but also to weather the challenges that they face. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sahad, for sticking so close to time. We're going to try to go back to Bianca and the mining operations in Eastern Cameroon. Bianca, hopefully we'll have a more stable connection this time.
I'm so sorry, Perfume. I have probably a network issue. I don't know really what it is, but let me just get back to my presentation. I think I was already a few minutes in, but just to get back to context, I was presenting on mining exploitation in the eastern region of Cameroon and the predominance of the Chinese companies, which we have observed given our field activities and the interviews we conducted, go in violation even of the established mining code of Cameroon, and also is detrimental to the environment, the surrounding environment for local populations that live around those mining sites, and even the rights of the workers in those sites are undermined because labor laws are not respected in terms of working conditions, social security, and even basic contracts that workers should have when they're employed by a company. And now we notice particularly, for example, that given the diversity of mining permits that can be issued by the government of Cameroon for the different categories of mining activities, because there are semi-mechanized activities, there are artisanal activities, and then there are industrial mining activities. So for each of those activities, the procedure to have the permit is different, and the authority, the authority that delivers that permit is also different. Artisanal, semi-mechanized, they are obtained through the Ministry of Mining, but industrial mining permits are granted by the President of the Republic himself. But in all of these cases, there has been some level of contempt each time we have information on, should I say, a new mining permit that is granted to this or that company. In almost all cases, the companies that are chosen are Chinese companies. Even in certain instances, there are new companies that have less than 1 year of existence. Meanwhile, the mining code gives a certain level of financial and even organizational requirements that a company has to demonstrate to be able to have those that authorization, that mining permit. So these are a number of elements that have been observed. And now moving to concrete observations on site, we see that these Chinese, they're able to go around the mining code because they use even Cameroonians themselves as, should I say, figureheads. That means they're just the ones that are present in front for the paperwork, but on the field, they're all Chinese companies owned by the Chinese, funded by the Chinese, and all the benefits go to the Chinese. And on site, there are no, should I say, provisions taken to actually respect the environment and provides basic social amenities that communities are supposed to benefit from when a company is established in their zone. So in some of those areas, even potable water is affected. The lands that they usually use for the small farming, for subsistence farming, all of those become affected and polluted due to those mining activities. And even the aftermath of this exploitation is even more disturbing, because in certain cases, the mining sites are abandoned without a proper closeout. So sometimes we have sites that become, should I say, dangerous for the populations that live in those localities. Children end up drowning in some of those sites because now there is an accumulation of water when there is rainfall over a long period of time. And also, given that these mines are not properly closed out, it gives room for other local exploiters to come and continue illegal mining activities, which is very dangerous because there is no protection. They do not even have the necessary equipment to be able to carry out those mining activities. But given that these sites are open and not properly closed out and not even controlled by the authorities also in place, it gives room to all those who have access to them to be able to conduct their mining activities. And a major observation is that the East region of Cameroon is situated at the border of the country with Central African Republic. And we have realized that it's not a coincidence that that particular border zone is prone to a lot of security crises and kidnappings, and many security hazards happening around that zone because these mining sites are open. Some of these criminals have the opportunity to go and mine gold and sell in the black market. They have money to to procure themselves with certain arms or even enter into the country, into Cameroon illegally to continue perpetrating these their dangerous activities. So given these findings, we propose major recommendations that that should start from Cameroon itself, its authorities, respecting the mining code that has been established to protect Cameroonians, to protect Cameroonian resources, and to ensure that these resources benefit the country. Because the whole essence of Cameroon opening up the mining sector to other countries, to other exploiters, it's because it has placed mining exploitation as one of the pillars of its social and economic development, its agenda that is to go from 2020 to 2030. But for now, these benefits of mining are not coming back to the Cameroonian economy. They are not benefiting Cameroonians, and even Cameroonian environments are being put at risk. So that was the major recommendation. And also, just to continue to write about it, to talk about it, there are a number of newspapers, even besides our research work, the newspaper articles, the online articles that talk about this issue, and we hope that over time, the tendency is going to change. So thank you all so much for your attention. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you so much, Bianca, and we're glad you were able to return with much better quality sound. Wonderful. Our last research project today is going to be from Prolific Matarus. Prolific.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much. I hope that everyone can hear me. So my research is touching on the geopolitics of coal and lithium in Zimbabwe, where I was looking at the interesting dynamic of how Zimbabwe's mineral wealth and energy constraints affect its international relations, such that it is important to connect domestic power demand and deficits, also hydrocarbon bias and international lithium trade, and how Zimbabwe specifically navigates this landscape in the context of sanctions, because it's a country that's been sanctioned since 2002, sanctioned by the US, by the EU, by Switzerland, by Australia, by Canada. Many countries have sanctioned it since 2002. So how does Zimbabwe navigate those situations? So to do this, I had to go to the lithium mining areas and the coal mining areas to specifically understand where Chinese people, Chinese investors are operational. So I visited the almost, I should say, about 2 specific mines where I spoke to specific company respondents, but I also visited almost 6 other mines where I also spoke to other workers from those. Then I also visited communities, several communities where I was asking the community members, the leadership, and also civil society organizations and some legislators as well, inquiring about this particular matter. So why this particular study was also very important was that in 2021, President Xi had actually banned the use of coal or the exploration or the start of new coal projects. So it was very interesting to actually see what was the result. So also in literature, people had discussed a lot about loopholes in the ban, especially relating to existing projects, people wanting to extend old projects, and also a discussion of captive power stations, which are power stations that are built to support a particular industry or a particular investment. So that was very interesting for me to look at. Then there was also a particular important discussion that relates to differences between China's climate policy as it related to its domestic policies and overseas policies, that there were differences. So it was also very important for me to look at that. And also to seek to understand, African governments, the Zimbabwean government preference for coal. Why do they keep insisting on using coal and on actually looking for more coal investments? So that was very interesting. So in terms of the findings, one of the things that I quickly discovered when I was talking to people is that people believe that the Chinese investors, they have zero interest in responsible investment. So they had the evidence that would show you several things. So they really believed that they had zero interest in responsible investment. There was also lack of knowledge, local knowledge about the many elaborate public and private frameworks that the Chinese government has made as regarding responsible investments. They have very important investment guidelines that they've put out, but that are apparently not being observed, and also that the local communities are not aware of. So that was really something that stood out before we began talking about much things. Then there was also the issue to do with the electricity deficiencies, which I think are very pivotal to my study eventually, where there was acute shortages in the country, in Zimbabwe. The country has a demand of about 1,950 megawatts, 1,950 megawatts. And that figure is actually expected to grow to 5,000 megawatts by 2030. So already at this little demand of almost 2,000 megawatts, you find there are serious shortages of load shedding, which lasts from about 12 hours, sometimes to 14 hours. So by each day, as things go, the demand is increasing. But where is this demand coming from? It's coming partly from rural electrification, but it's also mainly coming from mining, in particular the processing of metals that include lithium. So in terms of the core projects, I discovered that the new core projects, and some of these new core projects are grid connected. They are feeding into the grid for everyone to benefit from. But some of them are also supporting certain industries. That's why they are called captive stations. And they're making use of loopholes or gray areas in the ban that have also been identified also in areas like Bangladesh, Indonesia, where it has been established that the loopholes have been something that's been used. But I also discovered that there's been intensified coal mining as a result. So there are many coal mines that have actually, as Chinese investors actually invest in those coal mines. Then, so this finding, the finding that the new core projects that are happening in Zimbabwe, then raised two questions that I will not address now, but that are very related and very important. It begs the question then, is the core capacity being built not directly contravening Chinese state policy? So it's a question that I answer yes, but I will not address that now. Then also to really seek to understand whether these expansions are for captive power stations or they are also for public use. It's a very important question relating to the particular one on whether there is Chinese state policies being contravened or not. Then when it comes to lithium, what's important is also maybe to just briefly characterize the nature of lithium mining in Zimbabwe and the nature of lithium resource in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, unlike in Latin America, they have hard rock lithium. In Latin America, they have brine resources. So hard rock lithium actually involves issues to do with blasting, issues to do with crushing, chemical treatment. It also requires greater energy requirements. And also that means it also causes greater damage to the environment. So there are some concerns that actually emanate as a result of the nature of the resource itself. As a result, then related to that, we noticed that mainly it's private sector companies, multinational corporations from China that almost have an exclusive mining rights in the country. But interestingly to that, these Chinese companies also have off-take agreements with companies in the West like BMW, Tesla, in Volkswagen. So they might not be necessarily doing the actual mining, but they are also buyers from those that do the dirty work on the ground. Then in the case of Zimbabwe, what I also noticed, which was very interesting, unlike other African countries and other even Latin American countries where lithium mining is happening, in Zimbabwe, they've actually managed to force the Chinese investors to do some processing or some basic processing of the lithium. But also with that basic processing comes another aspect. It means that it's energy intensive, so it requires much more electricity. So that explains also the whole the issue with the demand, the increased demand in electricity. So it has also worsened the energy security aspects. Then also linked to this is the whole discussion about de-risking that's been happening in the West, where people have been talking about de-risking, finding alternative supply sources. The result is that there's been intensified consolidation of Chinese influence in lithium mining and refining to hedge their early move advantage. So you can actually see that they are really consolidating with the ruling party and also exploring new areas. Then I also found out that apart from the formal multinational corporations, there are also other smaller, almost artisanal miners or small-scale investors that come to invest in artisanal miners and small-scale miners. So these smaller investors, most of their investments are almost illegal. So it's also almost connected to smuggling and illicit financial flows where people smuggle lithium as raw ore, going to neighboring Mozambique and also going to South Africa via South Africa. But also linked to that artisanal mining are also other minerals which are not lithium, but which are rare earth minerals, beryllium, antimony. So there are some photos that I took about some of the marketing that happens at night for the sale of these things. But also from all the mines that I visited in the 3 areas, actually in the 4 areas that I visited, people consistently talk about persisting environmental and human security concerns, whether it's in coal, it's in lithium, there was this particular concern. So you could see a lot of derelict pits that have not been rehabilitated. And there were so many stories about kids falling in there, livestock falling into those pits, the typical stuff that's been established. So, but why is it important to talk about this? Everything that I've been talking about, why is it important? For me, I thought it's very important to really highlight this, especially like in my case, I come from a background of advocacy and working with civil society organizations. Just for those people that are in that sector to be aware that the Chinese government has these frameworks and guidelines, I think is a very important advocacy tool when they are talking about climate policy, when they are talking about environmental management. I think those are very important advocacy measures to also be talking about. But the major problem that I then identified and that I think still is the broader issue beyond Zimbabwe is really how to finance, energy security deficits, and also how to finance, climate issues, the climate finance. What's the best way to go about that? Because when you look at countries like Zimbabwe, what they are really seeking for, is longer, it's flexible and cheaper financing, and which also does not discuss people and planet separately, but which rather connects the saving of the planet and also the saving of the people. It has to be one conversation, simultaneous conversation. It's not a non-sequential approach, but it has to be something that happens at the center. So, and it seems like China has really stepped out onto that in terms of providing funding that was meeting the needs of the Zimbabwean government. So what this speaks to, it speaks to the broken development financing system globally that makes it harder for developing countries to adapt to and mitigate climate change. So also, especially in the context of a country that is under sanctions, then clearly there is tension between Southern African core buyers. So this is not just a Zimbabwean thing, that's another thing. It's a Southern Africa thing where you find that there is a lot of dependence on coal. So there's really that tension between Southern African core buyers and Western decarbonization initiatives. Yes, I had to call them Western because they'll be promoted usually. And also China's complex role between the two, where China, you find domestically is promoting a climate sensitive policy, but overseas you find it's another policy altogether. But also in the whole mix, a new variable has emerged, especially with the return of President Trump, just looking at what he said yesterday, with the tariffs and all, it also brings in a new dimension as to everything else, the whole de-risking conversation, the role of Western powers in the whole system, in the reactions of countries like China, whether they are going to cement, how are they going to increase their role locally. I think, Prof, I can stop there and maybe take it up later on in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prolific. And now we're going to hear from our discussant, Idris. Idris, you can go ahead and unmute. Perfect.
Thank you very much, Prof. I must say that I have learned a lot listening to the researchers, and my contribution will be as an editor of a newspaper. I'm not an academic, so please I'll try to understand where I'm coming from. The first thing I would say is that for Philip, I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought your presentation was perhaps the most detailed. But the first thing that struck me with the presentation was that you stuck to the title of the piece without helping, perhaps as an academic researcher, without helping your potential readers understand the topic. The topic, the way it is, the way it's written now is very academic. I expected you to use a sentence or two to just help me summarize what really do you want to tell me about this. That would have helped essentially suggest what would be like a working title if you're writing that for a newspaper, rather than just sticking to this headline that you gave. Second is that listening to your presentation from the start to the end, I was still confused if the six firms you focused on were Chinese firms. That was not clear all through, whether they were local firms or whether they were Chinese firms. You were right to specify that you were focusing on 6 firms, but are those 6 Chinese owned or are they locally owned? And then also, while focusing on those 6 firms, I didn't get any good explanation for the reason why you are focused on those 6. Essentially, you missed the opportunity to help us understand better details of those 6 firms. The other thing is that I felt you also missed the opportunity to contextualize the need for PSCs in Kenya. I know you tried to talk about the ratio of PSCs in the UK and other developed countries and show the similarities, 1 to 2, 1 to 6, and so on. But what I would be interested in as an editor is, why does Kenya need PSCs? What's the population of Kenya? What's the population of the Kenya police? Is it below global standards, the UN recommended ratio? Is that why PSCs are proliferating? You miss that opportunity to provide proper context. You tried to provide some context, but it wasn't as directly addressing the issue. The other point is that you did not help us understand at what point did PSCs become prevalent in Kenya. Was that from independence, or did it start 20 years ago? What happened that led to that? I never got that all through your presentation. And like I said, I enjoyed the presentation because it had a lot of specifics. However, there was too much repetition. And that was why you spent some, perhaps way beyond the time that you had. And the reason why I suspect the repetition occurred was that your presentation, in my view, was not properly structured. If you are writing for an audience, so that I'm not talking of an academic audience now, a global for general readers who are not academics, you need to better structure and avoid repetition. What we journalists call the Occam's razor, you need to just try to make your sentences shorter and go straight to the point while presenting your facts in a logical manner. I think you spent so much time on repeating what you had said earlier. Overall, while your presentation was detailed, in my view, it did not satisfy the curiosity created by your working title. Your working title of private security companies in Kenya, a comparative case study analyzing Chinese, local, and Western private security actors. Because you did not let me know if those 6 companies were Chinese, you said they were all private, but what kind of private companies are they? So after listening to you, I did not feel satisfied that you addressed what your topic was, what the topic was. That's my overall summary for Philip. For Bianca, I really enjoyed your presentation. You went straight to the context. Why is the research important? I love that. But I felt you should have also used just a sentence or two to summarize the topic. I talk about topics and titles because a lot of times academics have your own style of writing titles, but we in the media have a different style because we are writing for a larger audience. And so when you then write academic titles without essentially summarizing what you really want to tell in a simple form beyond the academic, then you could lose your readers to that. So you didn't do that, but I like the way you went straight to the context of why the research is important. You spoke about the increasing presence of Chinese firms into Cameroon since the relationship between the two countries started. But you provided no date to help us know when this relationship started. So I tried to think over my head, do I need to go and do research to find out what particular year this new relationship started? So you didn't do enough justice to that. I like the way you provided a simple summary of your methodology, the travels, the interviews. I thought that was very I mean, even if you write like that for a newspaper, it's just summarize. It's a good way. We traveled to these places, we had interviews, so it just that was very helpful for me. We talked about the fact that there seems to be a preference to granting Chinese firms mining rights. Many workers of such firms violate laws such as labor laws, environmental laws, but you missed, and this was common to virtually all of you except Philip, who spoke first. You missed the opportunity to give specific examples. Philip was the only one who said, of these 6 companies, this particular one did this. When you write for a larger audience, specific examples stay more with people rather than generalized statements. So rather than saying the companies violated the laws, it's good. For example, this particular company did this from our findings. That sticks more with the readers or with viewers. So you miss the opportunity to give specific examples of your companies, naming a particular company and a particular law they violated based on your findings. Audiences often remember specifics better. Also, when you spoke about Chinese firms going around the mining codes, you also made the example of giving one example of such. That, for example, we found out that this particular company did this, had to do this. I think you also missed that example. When you spoke about the abandonment of some of the mines and no proper closure to them, that was another example to give. Just one example suffices. For example, in this particular community, we found 6 mines that had been abandoned. There was no effort to ensure proper closure of the mine. It helps. It stays with people more rather than general. The general statements are good in terms of the findings, but just a sentence or two about specific examples would really be very good. So, but overall, I really learned a lot from your research, and I look forward to reading the final copy too, even as a journalist. For Sakad's presentation, Sakad provided the date of the commencement of the official relationship between Somaliland and Taiwan. that was missing in the first in the previous presentation, like I said. So I know when you are starting what you have the period you are focusing your research on. I like the way each topic was the simplest. So even if you're writing for a newspaper, your topic could easily be adapted without even changing because it's very straightforward and simple. So there was no need to explain again what the topic was. So I really like that. I like the way you summarize your main research question, even after your introduction. So you gave a good introduction and then said, what we tried to achieve was to answer this research question. So for me, you were the only one that did justice to that, bringing your audience back to say, I've introduced this to you, but this is what I'm trying to achieve with this piece. But I thought you could have done a bit more justice to your methodology. So for example, even after listening to you, do not understand how you actually did the research. Whether you had interviews, whether you did travels, that was not clear all through your presentation. So I think there was a huge problem with with the way you explained your methodology. I'm sure it's detailed in your findings, but in your own presentation, I did not really get that. And I'm not saying as an editor, I'm not interested in you justifying why you chose your methodology. Whether you chose quantitative over qualitative, whether you chose, I'm not interested in that, but I want to know how you did it. So I traveled, interviewed 6 companies. I read 20. It's important to help. I didn't get that in your presentation. I like the way you summarized your conclusion. I really enjoyed the way you summarized your conclusion. I felt you did a lot of justice to it, and I really learned a lot about Somaliland and Taiwan and the relationship. I felt you had you put a lot of context to it, your findings, your conclusions, and how you summarized the final conclusion. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. For Prolific, I like the way you summarized your headline. You were perhaps the only one who did a summary, say, this is the working title, but what we tried to do was this. I really enjoyed that. Even though your summary of the headline was a bit lengthy, but you were the only one that did that. And for me, as someone who perhaps is not too keen about understanding academic jargons, I knew what you were trying to do right away by you explaining what the working headline was. I like your historical context that you gave when you mentioned the specific dates that the agreement started in 2021. That helped me know. Okay, so your research is focusing on what happened post 2021. So I like that a lot in terms of your presentations. When you summarize your findings, you also made the opportunity to give specific examples, whether it's specific individuals, specific communities. It doesn't have to be long. For example, in this particular community, this is what those specific examples help a lot. I think you made the opportunity to do specific examples. I like the way you mentioned some of the specific foreign companies that Chinese companies have partnerships with in the supply of lithium, even though you didn't mention any specific names of the Chinese firms themselves. You were the only one that mentioned something that is always of interest to those of us who edit print newspapers. Photos. I mean, perhaps it's not part of your remit, but for me as an editor of a newspaper, if you're telling me you've done so much research, you've traveled to places, do you have photos? You didn't even wait for me to ask before mentioning to say, yes, we have photos of some of the. I really love that. You were the only one that did that. I'm sure others also have, but you were the only one that mentioned that. I like the way you summarized the implications of your findings. So you not only spoke about the conclusion, you spoke about the implications and even related it to latest happenings that perhaps are even outside of. So for me, you were the only one that essentially convinced your audience, in this case, your readers, because I edit a print and online newspaper. You're the only one that convinced that you are not just focusing on your research, but you are relating your research to latest happenings. We talked about President Trump's speech and the possible implications. I really love that. I think it's important while we are focusing on what we have researched to then relate it to what is perhaps happening of recent beyond what we had found out when we conducted our research. I think you were the only one that did that in your presentation. Thank you very much. That'll be all from me.
Idris, thank you so much. I think as academics, one of the challenges for all of us, after having taken all of this time and effort and energy to do the research and try to write it up, is this question of, who's going to read my work? How can I expand my impact, right? Beyond the 10 people who are going to read the academic journal article. So your comments are very welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully, as the researchers, the projects represented here, and the other 4 or 5 that were part of this big project, as they continue to write up, we'll have both academic contributions as well as media, kind of public, shorter pieces coming out soon. I know we started a little bit late, so I want to try to go over, maybe recapture those 10 minutes, and I wanted to give Mustafa an opportunity to add anything perhaps that Saad might have missed, or bring around some comments. So please.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for the opportunity, and I hope you can hear me. Okay, good. Yeah, I think Saad put it perfectly, what we tried to do with the research. But on the light of the comment from Idris, I think we'll just mention about the methodology. So what we did, it was qualitative interviews with government officials in Somaliland and also Taiwan, but also academics both from Taiwan and Somaliland. And we also tried to talk to, because there's an element of engagement with the United States that came up quite strongly in the research. We tried to speak with people familiar with the subject. So we also read documents, official documents from both sides, and followed what was going on. For us, like, also the study is interesting because what's happening also has a further implications, and like also, so what do you just mentioned, and but what does it mean for now? Like how this will be, how this research will reflect what's going on or will happen in the future. So this topic of geopolitical competition between China and the United States, it's manifesting itself quite increasingly in the Horn of Africa. And there's more discussions now of governments Somaliland trying to sell this relationship with Taiwan as something they can, get something as a leverage from the United States. So it's something going on. It's a conversation that's happened different ways. But we also thought about how we can simply write to an audience other than academics. So so I really appreciate like the points Idris mentioned on that. I think it was really insightful project for both of us. We're also like challenging because access to government officials, it has its own issues, but overall was really insightful. And we've learned a great deal from the comments we received from Obert, and it was something really appreciate. So yeah.
So much, Mustafa. Obert, I also wanted to return to you and see if you had any questions or final comments in general or for any of the specific projects.
Well, I think in general, I'd say I'm really proud of the work that you all have done. And I think you bring a fresh perspective. If I pick, for instance, on Somaliland, on lithium mining in Zimbabwe, or even what Bianca was looking at in Cameroon. I think these are all fresh perspectives, I think, something that has been missing in the writing on China-Africa relations, because in most cases, it's very easy to look at things from a state level, right? China is doing this in Zimbabwe, China is doing that in Africa. But to be able to go to the mining areas, to the villages, and to talk to people who are actually affected by this. I think that's really empowering, not just to the academics who read your work, but also to the people who you have talked to and they feel that their voice counts, right? And I think perhaps thinking about how to relate your research to the communities that you engaged, which is where I think Idris' comments come in, to package it in a way that people are also able to understand these issues. And I think that's really empowering. And like Prof. Divik was talking, the advocacy that people sometimes feel disempowered because they actually do not have the information on what the impact of China's activities in their communities are, or even what their governments are. So I think this is really amazing work that you have done, and I really want to congratulate you for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Obert. Philip says he needs to drop off. Perhaps before he does, he can take one of the questions from the audience. Afanwi Che asks if you can share any observations about geographical or sectoral distribution of the Chinese PSEs in Kenya, if they're concentrated in any particular place, and also whether or not there's any security technology transfer taking place from either Chinese or Western security companies. And then let me just read the final question, and it's regarding the two mining projects, so Bianca and Prolific. Afanwi also wanted to find out if there were, if you observed tensions or disputes between local and Chinese miners, and if so, how were these disputes managed? Let's just take those, and perhaps Philip, you can respond first before you have to go to your class.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof. Let me respond to, also I do have to acknowledge comments from Professor Idris, which I think will help build on my final document. But just to respond briefly, is that he asked at what point did PSE become prevalent in Kenya? They emerged in Kenya immediately after independence, but their dominance arose after the structural adjustment programs in the year 1980s. Then about contextualization, I think that will do. And then for the 6 firms which he requested for justification, I selected firms which have had working experience with Chinese actors. And therefore, that was the basis, the criteria that I decided to use. Those firms are also the most dominant in Kenya. In fact, they control close to 70% of the private security market in Kenya. The question from the panelists about evidence of security training, about security transfer, I have to agree that yes, there is, because as I have said, is that in the context of DV security, for example, it was able to even train the local security, the local police, and even the subcontracted firms on new dynamics in terms of identifying security threats, and even detection, and even the utilization of other security assets. Yes, the other thing is about concentration. I've emphasized that DV security has an office here in Nairobi. However, it largely subcontract, and therefore its concentration is majorly on the Chinese asset, predominantly on the standard gauge railway, where it tries to coordinate in terms of guiding on the security plans and enforcement mechanisms. Otherwise, thank you, Prof.
We go to Bianca briefly, and then Prolific.
Okay, thank you so much. I would equally like to thank Idris for his comments. They're well noted and will really help us in improving the final short form of this article. Now, regarding the question, if we observed tensions or disputes between the Chinese miners and the local miners, those are Cameroonian miners, well, we did not notice those disputes between the Chinese miners and the Cameroonian miners. What we noticed were disputes between the Chinese miners and the local populations, those in the surrounding communities, or even some Cameroonians that are employed on those mining sites. At times, they are really, really very serious, very grievous, to the point that some people end up very, very, very harmed, injured. I don't even want to say it, as we've gotten reports of situations where somebody even ends up dying because one employee who was not happy comes to the Chinese company to should I say, to claim certain rights, or an employee who was laid off, should I say, in their opinion, illegally, will come to claim some of their rights, and then it's going to be back and forth between the employee and the company, and at times it could get violent. Authorities usually intervene in some cases, but the tendency also is for protection to be more on the foreign and not even the Cameroonians themselves. So that is very strange, but that's how it is. And even most of these mining sites, you observe that there are some, should I say, barriers that are put to protect those that work on the side as the Chinese. And there are security men, like military officials stationed around most of them. So even having access to them is already a challenge. And these tensions with local communities, that's what is very, very rampant, but not between the other Cameroonian miners, who I think now they even work more smoothly with the Chinese companies. Yeah, that's the observation for the case of Cameroon. Thank you.
Ed Prolific.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we noticed some clashes between the Chinese companies and local miners, in particular over land rights. Where does the claim end? And frequently there was no documentation of the Chinese investors having claim over certain lands. So there was always that clash also with artisanal miners who were trying to mine lithium. So there was police presence to ensure that there's no artisanal mining in those areas. But I think the biggest thing was the absence of the environmental impact assessments generally, and communities complain, about the absence of EIAs, issues to do with labor rights, and also the mining practices, where people complained about the use of certain chemicals that were causing diseases, and also the issue of water shortages in the community, especially where lithium is concerned, because it's a water-intensive mining process. So in some of the cases, you find the cases that made it to the headlines. So there are many cases that don't make it to the headlines. So the community is powerless in those cases. But in the cases that make it to the headlines, you find there are organizations, environmental organizations, that try to litigate on behalf of the community. And in some cases, they have actually won. I also noticed that there's been the rise of ESG and CSR discussions, especially where the companies themselves are trying to initiate some sort of CSR and ESG practices, but they are also very problematic practices, the way they are doing them. Yeah, but the last point that I'll make is the point to do with the nature of the state that is created when sanctions, international sanctions, are actually being used as like the moral ground, justifying that the ends justify the means. So some of the wrongs are brushed under as a result of that sanctions discourse within Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prolific. I just want to close out the webinar by saying thank you to all of our participants, the researchers, Obert for doing the introduction and giving a general background, and to Idris, our discussant, who provided some really, really insightful comments for our researchers as they work to finalize their written products from this really important research. I wanted to thank you, also thank the two other members of the Research Advisory Committee, in addition to myself and Obert, Lena Ben Abdallah and Cobus van Staden served as advisors, mentors to the researchers on this project. I wanted to say a quick thank you to Brennan, who is our program assistant, for all of his work behind the scenes, to our co-sponsors, the African Study Center at Howard University and Georgetown's initiative on US-China dialogue for global issues. And finally, I wanted to let you all know that a final event for the term, the spring term here at Georgetown, will be a half-day seminar, and it'll be similar to this, the culmination of some research that's been ongoing by the ACI Research Working Group on digital engagements between China and Africa. So research on AI, facial recognition technology, and Huawei and all kinds of other areas of digital engagement between China, Africa, and other partners. And that will be coming up on Friday, the 25th of April. It will be a half day, so essentially a keynote and a panel discussion. We'll be sending out more information about that shortly, so please keep an eye on your inboxes. If you haven't joined the mailing list, please contact us directly at ACI so you can get on and find out about future events. And keep an eye on this space because the other 5 projects that were part of this program, those researchers will be presenting their work in the fall. So again, thank you to the audience members who stuck with us through the end. Apologies for all of the technological glitches, which are, I guess, these days expected. And again, thank you so much to all of you for joining us for this important event. And thank you finally again to the researchers for your really hard work. Doing research in Africa, especially trying to get access to government officials or going into areas where there's mining and heavy security is not an easy task, and we commend you for all of your hard work and perseverance in getting this done. So again, thank you all very much.